Cool. So we are going to get started right now. We'll just let people trickle in as they do, but we want to get going. There's still a lot of time, and there'll be plenty of time for people to, see the remarks and see some of the questions that we prepare. Cool. So, uh, hi everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. My name is Shriram, and I'm currently a member of Stanford in Government, Stanford's leading nonpartisan political organization on campus. Before we go any further, I want to take this time to thank SIG's co-sponsors for this event, namely the Stanford Speakers Bureau and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and their Cyber Policy Center. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, Congressman Adam Schiff. Congressman Schiff is currently the representative for California's 28th District in the United States House of Representatives. And Congressman Schiff currently serves as the chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, overseeing the nation's intelligence agencies. In the past, he's also served as the Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Office of the U.S. Attorney for the Central District, as well as a senator for the 21st District in the California State Senate. Congressman Schiff also happens to be a fellow Cardinal, having graduated in 1982 with a bachelor's in political science. He then went on to Harvard Law School to receive his JD. And so without further ado, here is Congressman Adam Schiff. Congressman Schiff, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and thanks so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be virtually back on campus. I had such a wonderful experience as an undergraduate at Stanford, and I love every interaction that I get to have with the farm. So thanks for inviting me to be back. The topic of the discussion tonight is a very broad one. It's hard to know where to begin. So I thought that I would start, it's as good and as arbitrary a place as any other, to talk about 2014, 2015, when North Korea hacked Sony Pictures. And you might recall that the North Koreans, particularly Kim Jong-un, were upset with the portrayal of the dear leader, the supreme leader, in this parody, this not even very good parody, this actually pretty bad film called The Interview. And as a result of this film, they hacked the studio. They destroyed, I think, hundreds or thousands of computers at the studio. But more debilitating, they stole a bunch of emails, purportedly terabytes worth of data. And then they fed the hacked materials to a very grateful American press, the Hollywood Reporter and Variety, etc. A lot of these emails were quite salacious, involving studio executives and celebrities, and what this studio executive had to say about this prima donna or vice versa. And of course, it injured relationships. It cost the studio a ton of money. When this happened, I had a lot of interests and concerns about this. I was already concerned from a First Amendment point of view with China and its ability to essentially put a veto on certain films that carried content that was critical of China, because studios couldn't expect that China would air a film that intruded in any way with criticism of China in China. And if you can't exhibit your films to a market that big, then maybe you shouldn't make the film. So I was already concerned with, First Amendment restrictions being imposed by other states, other nations. But then you had to layer on that this was an attack, a destructive attack. And I was very strongly of the view that it needed a response. This was during the Obama administration. And the response didn't need to be a tit for tat. In fact, I wasn't recommending a tit for tat. Unquestionably, our cyber capabilities compared to North Korea are overwhelming, and we could have devastated North Korea had we wanted to. But it's a very asymmetrical battlefield. I remember when the Obama administration finally made attribution that North Korea was behind the attack. the lights started flickering and going out in Pyongyang, and the press and others were speculating, is that the Obama administration's cyber response? If it wasn't a very effective one because the lights are always going out in Pyongyang. And part of what you would want in a cyber response is a deterrent value. And if those you're trying to deter can't tell whether they're being deterred, they're not likely to be deterred. But moreover, even if we used a cyber response that was more commanding, their capabilities might be less, but our vulnerabilities are every bit as great, and they could still do us significant harm. And so what I was suggesting at the time was that we use the tactics that the South Koreans use. When they're bombarded with North Korean artillery, they respond with information warfare. They crank up the loudspeakers and they blare information into the North about what a terrible regime the North Koreans are forced to suffer. They leaflet, they do what they can to educate the people of North Korea, and the North Korean regime hates it. And it's a deterrent. And I was urging that we do something similar. We already heavily sanction North Korea. We could add more sanctions, but instead we didn't really do anything. We merely named and shamed. And even then, you had sort of pundits saying, where's your proof, Obama administration? Are we supposed to take your word for it? Now, I'm sure the North Koreans and the Russians and the Chinese and everybody else that were watching, the Iranians, would love to know how we can attribute cyber attacks, because then they can more carefully hide their hand. So the Obama administration wasn't prepared to do that. But what I was concerned about at the time was other nations would be watching. And if there seemed to be no price to be paid, if there was always plausible deniability, then we could expect a lot more where this came from, and frankly, a lot more of far greater import. And that is, I think, what we have seen over the years. We have seen extensive and devastating cyber hacks and thefts, like China's theft of millions of records and files from the Office of Personnel Management. More recently, the Russian SolarWinds attack, the length and breadth of which we still don't fully know and may not know for a long time. And even then, we may not fully know whether we've kicked them out of our system without burning the system to the ground. But you've also had devastating attacks, like the Russian attack on our democracy in the last several elections. And so this is, the Wild West, both in terms of the capacity for stealing data, but also doing great harm. And it offers the aggressor tremendous benefits at very little cost. And we're going to need to change that calculus. We're going to need to do a much better job defending ourselves. We're going to need to do a much better job deterring others, and developing some rules of the road. Otherwise, it's just going to be chaos. Already, hospitals around the country, including in my district, have been the victims of ransomware attacks, where I remember one of my hospital CEOs telling me a couple of years ago that their hospital data had been encrypted by some outside party. And they were told, you need to pay us $17,000 or you're not getting your data back. And they went to the FBI and said, what do we do? And the FBI said, well, if you want your data, you're going to have to pay them. They were lucky that the hackers only wanted $17,000. That was a few years ago. I'm sure the price would be much higher now. But this is a phenomenal challenge across every domain, in terms of protecting our data, protecting our satellites, protecting our technological eyesight, protecting our critical infrastructure, and including our elections infrastructure. So huge topic, great consequence, and look forward to discussing it with you, as well as a whole range of other science and technology issues.
Great. First off, thank you so much. That was great. I think one thing that we wanted to zero in on, because it's a very recent issue, and it's something that you mentioned, was the SolarWinds hack. And so this was it was somewhat similar to the hack of the North Korean film a few years ago, in that it focused on the private sector. And so one question we had was what you believe the short and long-term implications are for national security policy because of the SolarWinds hack? What are the short-term implications in actually plugging the hole in a sense, because it's still ongoing and we don't know its full extent? And what are the long-term implications for, developing better, habits, protocols, infrastructure to ensure a hack like that does not happen again?
Yeah. Great questions. And, when we were first developing kind of our modern cyber defenses, I remember, having discussions with elements of the intelligence community about the massive amount of money we were going to be investing in these systems. And were they confident that the defense would not be overcome by the passage of time? In other words, you invest billions and billions in the infrastructure of cyber defense, but the technologies change so quickly. Is it even possible to defend, to keep pace with the innovation that changes, at a rate of every 18 months or quicker? And I think the answer was unclear, and the answer today is even more unclear. The way the Russians were able to penetrate the defenses we erected is by attacking a vendor, part of the supply chain, doing essentially a Trojan horse, where in an illustration that you're only as secure as your weakest safeguard, they were able to insert themselves in certificated, authentic updates by the vendor, encrypted updates by the vendor. So how can you possibly determine if you are a customer, either a government customer or a private customer, and you get an update on your operating system or other critical software infrastructure, and it's authentic in the sense that it comes from the vendor, and it's encrypted, in which case it's very hard to determine if there's something that shouldn't be in there. You're relying on the vendor's security. And so I think this reveals a not surprising, but nonetheless gaping vulnerability. And even now, I think we are still looking at how many vectors of vulnerability were there. Are we confident we have seen them all? And given that they had some time to burrow and hide and migrate into other places, how confident can we be that having identified how they got in, that we have gotten them out? And the long and the short of it is, I don't think we're anywhere near knowing yet the full capacity, the full extent of the compromise, how secure we are yet. And in terms of remedies, we're going to have to figure out how to have a much closer hand in glove partnership between public and private sector, because we don't want the public sector to have to invent all its own technology. It can't possibly keep pace with the private sector innovation. But we need to make sure that the private sector security is good enough to prevent these kind of things in the future. And how many private companies can compete with a nation state capability? So huge challenges awaiting this new administration. And one thing that has changed, fundamentally and importantly, is the current administration is willing to take on the malefactors. In the last administration, Russia has been, in terms of cyber attack, the worst offender. And we had a president unwilling to confront in any way that Russian actor. And we had a president, frankly, that in terms of China and its malign conduct, who was so quixotic in his approach that it was completely ineffective. And to give you, and I apologize for the length of my answer, but to give you an illustration, the president took action vis-a-vis ZTE and Huawei, these huge Chinese telecoms. But very quickly, after saying these were national security issues, at President Xi's request, in an effort to ingratiate himself, I guess, with President Xi as this supposed great deal maker, he said, well, okay, I'm going to reverse the sanctions on ZTE as part of the trade negotiation. Well, it's either a trade issue or it's a security issue. It shouldn't be both. And by making it unclear which it was, it lent the Chinese an argument with respect to Huawei and other issues with other nations around the globe that what the US is really concerned about is not privacy, it's not security, it's just protectionism. These are trade issues, they're not security issues. And that's not accurate, but the muddled approach of the last administration has made our job very, very difficult.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the point that you brought up at the end, where it really requires closer collaboration between the public and private sector because of the strength of the nation states we are going up against. And so that really led into what was going to be my next question, which is, what does the nature of that partnership look like? What government agencies are most involved? Is there a role for the committee, which you have, the Permanent Committee on Intelligence? How can we ensure that the public and private sector are working together? Because a lot of the software that we do use does come from the private sector, and we want to make sure that it can conform to the United States' security needs. So what does that relationship look like from your perspective?
Thank you. It's very multi-dimensional, even in the Intel world that I live in. And of course, that's just one world. But in the Intel world, the Intel community has a presence in the Silicon Valley, where it tries to partner with emerging technologies that may be of benefit to the Intel world, but also emerging technologies where they may need a capital investment, and so it's a synergistic relationship. There's a close relationship, although it's sometimes fraught, between the Intel and law enforcement communities and the Silicon Valley, particularly the social media platforms, over the degree to which those platforms are utilized to accelerate and amplify threats to the country along the lines of the white nationalist threat we experienced at the Capitol last month, or earlier this month, actually. We have tried to develop incentives for information sharing. I worked on a cybersecurity information sharing bill several years ago that became law. That didn't go far enough, frankly, but the premise of which was, when private companies see malicious intruders and identify the signatures of those intruders, we want them to share that with the government. And more than that, we want them to share that with other companies, so that if one company is hacked, or one company discovers a vulnerability, that it's not afraid to share it with others, that there will be some antitrust claim made against them if they do share information. They want to be able to share it with the government, and vice versa. They want the government, when we identify malactors that maybe the private sector hasn't seen yet, that we share that information too. So we did pass that. It's been a few years in running. Most of the information sharing, as I understand it, has been from the government to the private sector, not so much from the private sector to the government. And we're trying to figure out, okay, why is that? And how do we improve that communication? So, these are just some of the areas where there is collaboration and overlap and mutual interest. There are also processes where, for example, vulnerabilities in software produced by the private sector that are discovered by the public sector, there's a balancing of the equities there. If the IC, let's say the NSA, discovers there's a vulnerability that can be used to penetrate hostile foreign computers, but that same vulnerability can be used by hostile foreigners to penetrate US computers, there's a balance to be struck about when do you disclose to the vendor you got a problem, which protects the vendor and its customers, but also means lesser access for the intelligence community into foreign adversaries, which means less notice of something like SolarWinds. So there is a process set up for that. It's not a perfect process. It's a much better process than before, when there was no process, where there's an effort to make it transparent. So these are just some of the illustrations of how that partnership works in different domains.
Awesome. And this was one common question we got in the RSVPs, and it also seems like we got a similar question questions from Saurabh and Maya who are attending today, which is the importance of of both, I guess, semiconductors and 5G in our nation's infrastructure. So you had touched upon before about President Trump's stances on Huawei and ZTE and how that interacted with both trade and national security. And so I guess a lot of people want to know, and I'm also curious as to your perspective on the importance of 5G and semiconductors and semiconductor production in the coming decades, especially since a lot of it has been outsourced. How critical is that to our supply chain and our national security? And again, what does that public-private partnership look like in the coming months and years, decades?
I think there are a couple big issues implicated in your question. The first is how much of a supply chain risk do we have? And the answer is a huge supply chain risk. And if we needed evidence of that, SolarWinds is all the evidence we should need. And that's just one element of the supply chain. There are lots of different parts of the supply chain we can look at from the perspective of there are other opportunities for Trojan horses, and from the perspective that if there are vital components that we can't get anywhere else, even if they're not compromised, it means that a foreign nation like China has enormous leverage. We see that, for example, in the struggle to get PPE in the early part of the COVID and continuing to this day. But also when you look at some of the precursors that go into pharmaceuticals, they're not made here anymore. They're made in China. And that would give China a chokehold if it wanted on vital medicines in the United States. And so I do think we have to take a broad look at supply chain and figure out, okay, where are areas that we simply do not want to be reliant on other nations, and where are also the most keen vulnerabilities from a security point of view. But the other issue that is also, I think, a huge one is, can we compete with China when in certain areas of technology like 5G, when China has the capacity to throw billions of state resources into a company and underprice any competition around the globe, capture essentially a monopoly share, and then it can raise its price, of course. But how does Verizon, AT&T, how do any of these companies compete with a nation state that has a bottomless supply of wealth to force it out of competition? And does this mean that the US model is going to have to change? Are we going to have to develop much stronger relationships, make far different kinds of investments in our R&D to compete with that model? And, I don't know the answer to that. We're obviously looking at workarounds with respect to 5G, with other technologies where we can address the security vulnerabilities and not have to reinvent the entire 5G backbone. And so there's an effort to do that, and that might be successful. But even if we're successful with that vis-a-vis 5G, this will be a persistent problem in the future. If for critical infrastructure, China can give its companies an insurmountable advantage by dint of its resources. And I think we really have to ask some big, hard questions about how we compete with that.
Great. So this is kind of there's a bit of a pivot. I wanted to talk a little bit about your role, and these are, I guess, my two, there are two more questions that I have. One, I guess, is, your role as a legislator and as, a congressman. What strategies can the government use, whether it's, people in Congress, people who work in the federal bureaucracy, to translate, these complex technical issues with cybersecurity into the public debate? What does the public need to know? And then I guess also conversely, another side of it is, what can we do as citizens, as voters, to get involved in these kinds of issues when, the results of it, might be a little bit more distant than, for example, like economic relief?
I think one of the most cross-cutting issues, which I think, the generation on this call is much better situated to figure out than my generation, is how we now get our information To me, this is one of the most important cross-cutting issues that we face. We are in the middle of an information revolution, the significance of which is, I think, as great as the invention of the printing press. And the world had centuries to get used to that innovation. We've had, milliseconds to get used to social media. We live in a world now where fear and hate go viral, and lies travel at light speed. People live in silos where they are not exposed to contrary opinions. A huge part of the country believes that the last election was stolen and rigged, and there are huge groups of people joining together online who are united by bonds of hate and white nationalism. And I don't think we've begun to grapple with how we should get our information in this world, how we can be good consumers of information, how we can tell fact from fiction online, how we can avoid being stovepiped in the information that we get. When I was at Stanford, I rushed back to my dormitory one night to watch Walter Cronkite's last broadcast. That both shows how old I am, but also that was such a different world when there were 3 networks, people widely respected. I mean, the fact that I would even bother to go back to my dorm to watch someone's last broadcast, how many of you would bother to go back to the dorm to watch anybody's last broadcast now? I mean, maybe I would go to watch, Sean Hannity just to say, farewell, I hope I never see you again. But it's such a different world. We evolved from that, where there was a common body of accepted fact, to a model in the 90s with cable news, where people tuned in the channel they wanted to hear, to the model now where social media curates for us the information that we want to see. And so I don't know how we address that. I mean, we are looking at Section 230, the immunity that social media companies enjoy. That may be part of the answer, but that's only going to be a small part of the answer. The bigger answer is we're going to have to figure out how to maintain cohesion, not let this media environment tear us apart. And I'm really looking to your generation to help us figure this out.
Great. And so I guess that leads into the final question. And I know you're on a limited schedule, so I'll make it quick. It's just, I know, you went to Stanford. I'm just curious, how has it shaped your career trajectory? And like, what advice do you have for all the students, who are, panelists who are attending today, as they go out into this world, which is, changing at a rapid pace? How do we shape it so that, we have a government, we have a society that actually works for us and that actually, unites us instead of divides us, as you alluded to?
Well, I would say this. I was a poli-sci major at Stanford. My favorite class was modern physics. And, you would naturally reach that conclusion for a poli-sci major, but I was also pre-med. And as a result of being pre-med, I took physics and chemistry, I took literature, I took history, I took everything. And I loved it. I loved the diversity of what I was taking. And college is a time to be a great generalist. You may know already what you want to do in life. And if you do, that's great. I didn't know when I was at Stanford, and that was great too, because part of the fun is figuring it out. But I am so glad that I took all of those various classes and things that I might never use, because it was so much more interesting. It meant that I have a lifelong interest in a lot of things like Shakespeare and physics that I wouldn't have had if I was just razor focused on career. And so, my biggest recommendation to you all is take stuff you think will be of no use in your career, but you find interesting. Those of you that are going to graduate school will have plenty of time to specialize. This is the time to be a Renaissance person. I also always go with the professor. A great professor can make the most tedious subject wonderful, and the worst professor will take the best subject and ruin it. So take a lot of different things and look for the great profs.
I think that's a great note to end on. I think I've done that, but I guess I can do that for my last 2 quarters at Stanford. Congressman Schiff, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure. We really appreciate your time. We know how busy you must be, with the new administration. So really, it means a lot to us, at Stanford and government, but also at Stanford Speakers Bureau, and at FSI, for you to be able to come and meet with us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Stay well, stay healthy, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Congressman Schiff. And thank you everyone who came. Take care. Have a good night. Take care, everyone.
Good night.